My name is Lillian, and I was only 26 years old on the night that changed my life forever when my sister decided to run away with her lover and leave me with her seriously ill 10-year-old son. That night is carved into my memory like a wound that never fully healed as she stood in my doorway with a suitcase in her hand, while her eyes remained cold and her voice stayed sharp. Rain hammered against the windows behind her, creating a chaotic backdrop to the cruelty she was about to display. Her son Ethan was curled up on my couch at the time, burning with a high fever, and his small chest was rattling with every painful breath he took. The doctors had already warned our family that his condition was chronic and unpredictable, and I was shaking as I begged her not to leave him there. I pleaded with her to think of her own child, but she actually laughed in my face and said words that still echo in my head to this day. She sneered at me while I cried helplessly, clutching her sleeve in a desperate attempt to stop her until she ripped it away with force. She told me that he was my child now, and then she turned around and walked out into the rain with her lover without ever looking back at the son she was discarding. The door slammed shut with a finality that split my life into a before and an after, and I stood there in the silence realizing I had no idea how to raise a child, let alone one with such complex medical needs. At 26, I worked long hours and barely managed to pay my own rent, and suddenly I was thrust into a world of medications and urgent hospital visits. My nights became a cycle of counting his breaths and praying for the fever to break, while Ethan would wake up screaming in pain and calling for the mother who had just abandoned him. I found myself whispering lies to him that I hoped would someday become true, telling him that she would come back and that everything was going to be okay. Sometimes he would look at me with eyes that seemed far too old for a 10-year-old and ask if he had done something bad to make her leave. Each time he asked, my heart cracked a little more, but I knew I had to be the one to hold him together. The medical bills began to pile up faster than I could track them, and I was forced to sell my car and my jewelry to keep us afloat. My friend slowly drifted away when I kept canceling plans to stay by his bedside, and my sister never called once to check on him. There was no money sent and no messages of concern, as if she had completely erased her son from her existence, while I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by pill bottles and paperwork. Years passed in a blur of hospitals and hope that was constantly crushed and then slowly rebuilt. Ethan grew taller and thinner, but also stronger in ways the doctors once said might never happen for a child with his condition. He learned to manage his illness with a level of discipline that humbled me every single day as he studied hard, while driven by something fierce inside his soul. I worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, and there were countless nights when I cried in the shower so he wouldn't hear my despair. There were mornings when I had to smile through bone-deep exhaustion, because he needed me to be the strong one in his world. People often told me that I was throwing my life away by taking on such a massive burden at such a young age. They said I should have called social services or forced my sister to take legal responsibility for the child she had discarded. Maybe they were right from a practical standpoint, but every time Ethan smiled at me or called me mom by accident before blushing, I knew I had made the right choice. I refused to let him feel the sting of abandonment ever again, even if it meant sacrificing my own youth and my own dreams. I became his anchor in a world that had been incredibly cruel to him from the very beginning. My sister never sent a single dollar or a single message of concern during those 17 long years as she lived her life with her lover. I sold anything that wasn't nailed down just to pay for his treatments, and I watched my own social life disappear until it was just the 2 of us against the world. Ethan understood more than he let on, and he never stopped trying to prove that he was worth the sacrifice I was making. We celebrated small victories like a normal blood test or a school award as if they were major milestones, because for us, they truly were. I taught him that his worth was not defined by the person who walked away, but by the person who stayed. I taught him kindness even when the world hadn't been kind to him at all, and I made sure he knew he was wanted every single day. Somewhere along the way, without even meaning for it to happen, I stopped being just his aunt, and I truly became his mother in every sense that mattered. The night my sister left, I thought my life was over and that I had been handed an impossible burden to carry alone. But as the years went by, I realized that was actually the night my real story began, and the night I learned what true love actually costs. It was a journey of fear and exhaustion, but it was also a journey of discovering a strength I never knew I possessed. 17 years passed in a blur of survival and sacrifice, before my sister suddenly reappeared like a ghost from a past life. She showed up at a large family gathering, dressed in expensive designer clothes, and dripping with a confidence that felt like an insult to everything we had endured. She acted as if nothing had ever happened, and as if she hadn't left her dying child on a couch in the middle of a storm. She hugged relatives and laughed loudly while making herself the center of attention in the room. When she finally turned toward me, her eyes flicked around the space as if she were searching for something she had misplaced long ago. With a casual tone that made my blood run cold, she asked what had happened to the poor boy she had left behind so many years ago. She said it like she was asking about an old pet or a piece of furniture she had abandoned in a move. My hands began to tremble with a rage I had suppressed for nearly 2 decades, but I chose to say nothing in that moment. The room suddenly felt too small, and the air became too thick to breathe as the relatives watched us with bated breath. They all remembered the night she left, but most of them had stayed silent while I struggled to pay the medical bills and keep Ethan alive. My sister continued to chatter about her travels and her life with her lover, while she waited for an answer about the son she had discarded. She seemed convinced that the boy had either succumbed to his illness or was living a broken life in some state-run facility. She didn't notice the way the front door opened or the way the entire room suddenly went silent as a tall and handsome man in a tailored suit entered the space. His presence was commanding, and he walked with a posture that spoke of immense power and self-assurance. He ignored the gasps from the relatives and walked straight toward me with a focused expression. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and smiled at me with a warmth that finally grounded my shaking legs. My sister's confident expression shattered instantly, and the color drained from her face as she looked up at the man standing beside me. She recognized the features of the child she had abandoned, even though he was now a grown man who looked like he could buy and sell the room. Before he even spoke a word, the reality of her choices began to settle over her like a heavy shroud. This was the moment she had unknowingly walked toward for 17 long years, and she was completely unprepared for the man her son had become. The room froze when the tall, handsome man in a suit stepped fully into the light, and for a heartbeat no one dared to breathe. My sister's confident smile shattered as her lips parted and the color drained from her face, because she recognized him before he even spoke a single word. This was the moment she had unknowingly walked toward for 17 long years, and she stood there trembling as he adjusted his jacket with calm and controlled power. He looked at me with a warmth that grounded my shaking legs and called me Aunt Lillian while telling me he was here. Gasps rippled through the room as the realization spread like wildfire among our relatives. This wasn't some stranger or a coincidence, because this was Ethan, the seriously ill 10-year-old son my sister had abandoned. He had grown into a man who commanded silence just by standing there, and my sister staggered back a step. While whispering his name as if saying it might make him disappear, she muttered that it wasn't possible while her eyes darted between his face and mine in a state of pure shock. Just minutes earlier she had asked so casually what had happened to the poor boy she left behind, and now the answer stood directly in front of her, alive and strong. He was successful and completely out of her control, which was a reality she couldn't seem to process. Ethan didn't rush to her or offer a hug, and he didn't even look angry at the woman who had discarded him. He looked finished and calm in a way that only someone who has already survived the absolute worst can be. He told the room exactly who he was and what he had achieved in his life, despite the doctors once doubting he would even live past his teenage years. He spoke of the discipline and the resilience it took to overcome his chronic illness, and he spoke of the woman who raised him when no one else would. Every sentence he spoke tightened around my chest until I could barely breathe from the emotion of the moment. When he finally turned his gaze toward my sister, his voice remained steady and cold as he repeated her own words back to her. He said he is your child now, using every syllable unchanged from that rainy night 17 years ago. The room went completely silent as he explained how those words became the fuel that drove him through hospital wards and sleepless nights of pain. He told her how he learned very early that family isn't necessarily who gives birth to you, but rather who stays when leaving would be easier. My sister tried to interrupt him with tears spilling down her face as excuses began tumbling out of her mouth about her fear and desperation. Ethan listened politely to her frantic excuses as she tried to explain away 17 years of silence with tears and shaking hands. She spoke of her youth and her terror at the thought of losing him to his illness, claiming she only left because she couldn't bear the pain of watching him suffer. But Ethan simply shook his head and told her that she didn't get to rewrite the story just because she was uncomfortable with the ending. He looked her directly in the eye and said that while she walked away to save herself, I stayed to save him. The room felt like a vacuum as every relative watched the woman who had returned in designer silk shrink. Under the gaze of the son she had treated like a broken toy. He explained to everyone gathered that he had not only survived, but had thrived by building a career in medical research to help children suffering from the same condition he once had. He spoke about the sleepless nights I spent studying his medications and the 2 jobs I worked just to ensure he had the best care possible. Every word he spoke was a strike against the polished image my sister had tried to project since she walked through the door. She tried to reach out and touch his arm, but he stepped back with a clinical precision that was more devastating than a slap. He told her that he didn't know the woman standing in front of him, and that the only mother he had ever known was the one who had been there through the fevers and the surgeries. The relatives who had spent years whispering about my poor choices were now looking at my sister with a mixture of pity and judgment. She had come back expecting to find a tragic story that she could offer a little charity toward, but instead she found a mirror reflecting her own cowardice. Ethan didn't raise his voice or use insults because he didn't need to, as the truth was doing all the work for him. He told her that he had spent years asking why he wasn't enough for her to stay, and that I was the one who had to answer those impossible questions without poisoning his heart against her. He had grown up with a hole in his life that I had filled with every ounce of my own strength, and he wasn't about to let her pretend she had any part in his success. My sister collapsed into a chair, sobbing now and asking if there was any way to fix what she had broken so many years ago. She looked at our parents and our cousins for support, but they all looked away because the evidence of her abandonment was standing 6 feet tall and successful right in front of them. Ethan simply told her that some choices create distances that time cannot undo, and that she had made her choice the night she slammed the door. He wished her peace and then turned his back on her as if she were nothing more than a stranger he had met in passing. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that she was no longer the glamorous sister returning home, but a ghost haunting a life she no longer belonged to. The room remained frozen in a heavy silence as my sister continued to sob into her hands while sitting in that chair. No one moved to comfort her because the reality of her abandonment had finally been laid bare for everyone to see. I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief washing over me, as if a physical weight I had carried for 17 years was finally being shared. I looked at the relatives who had once whispered about my struggle and saw the shame in their eyes for having stood by while I nearly drowned in medical bills and debt. My sister tried to look up and catch my eye, pleading for some kind of sisterly mercy, but I found that I had nothing left to give her. Ethan stood by my side like a shield, his presence a constant reminder of every sleepless night and every shift I worked to keep us from losing our home. He told the gathered family that he had spent years imagining this confrontation, but now that it was happening, he realized she was just a small and frightened woman. He explained that he didn't want her money and he didn't want her apologies, because those things couldn't buy back the decade of health he had lost or the childhood he had spent in hospital wards. He told her that her reappearance wasn't a miracle, but an intrusion into a life she had forfeited the right to be a part of. The cousins and aunts began to murmur among themselves as the shock wore off and the social consequences for my sister began to set in. She had tried to walk back into our lives as a success story, but she was leaving as a cautionary tale of what happens when you prioritize a lover over a dying child. My sister finally stood up, her expensive clothes now looking wrinkled and her face streaked with ruined makeup. She lashed out one last time, claiming that I had turned her son against her and that I had spent 17 years poisoning his mind. But Ethan just laughed softly and told her that her absence had done more to poison his mind than any words of mine ever could. He reminded her that children are not memories that stay frozen in time while you go off to live a different life. He had grown up, and he had watched me struggle, and he had developed his own eyes to see the truth of who stayed and who ran away. He told her that he had no room in his life for someone who only showed up when the hard work was already finished. My sister looked around the room one last time, searching for a single ally, but every face was turned away from her. She realized then that she had not just lost her son, but she had lost her place in the family she thought she could manipulate with her newfound wealth. My sister stood in the center of the room, looking at the faces of our family and realizing that her expensive clothes and her stories of a successful life meant nothing in the shadow of her abandonment. She tried to say my name one last time, her voice cracking as she begged me to tell Ethan that she was still his mother. I looked at her, and for the first time in 17 years, I didn't feel the old anger or the crushing weight of the debt she left me with, because I felt nothing but a profound sense of pity. I told her simply that being a mother was a title earned through every feverish night and every hospital stay she chose to miss, and that she had resigned from that position a long time ago. Ethan didn't humiliate her further or raise his voice, because he didn't need to, as the truth of his presence was the most devastating weapon he possessed. He told her that he wished her a good life with the lover she chose over him, but that she was no longer allowed to call herself his family. He walked to the door and opened it for her, a silent gesture that signaled the end of the confrontation and the end of her presence in our lives. She gathered her designer bag and walked toward the exit, her head bowed as the relatives she had tried to impress watched her leave in total silence. The door closed behind her, with a soft click that felt much louder than the slam 17 years ago, because this time there was no hope of a return. As she disappeared into the night, the room finally began to breathe again, and the whispers of our relatives started to fill the space like a rising tide. They began to approach us with apologies and praise for how well Ethan had turned out, but Ethan wasn't interested in their late-coming approval. He kept his hand on my shoulder as a constant anchor while we navigated the awkward social circle of a family that had mostly watched from the sidelines while we struggled to survive. He made it clear to everyone that he wasn't there to represent the Bennett name, but to support the woman who had actually fought for his life when the doctors and his own mother had given up. We didn't stay long after that, because the air in that house was still thick with the ghosts of the past and the judgment of people who didn't understand the cost of our victory. As we walked to his car, I looked at him and saw the 10-year-old boy who used to cling to my hand during painful treatments, and I saw the man who had just dismantled a 17-year-old lie. He told me that he had been nervous about seeing her again, but that seeing her in person made him realize he hadn't lost anything when she walked away. He had gained a life and a mother who actually loved him, and that was a trade he would make 1,000 times over. The drive home was quiet as the city lights blurred past the windows, and the weight of the evening finally began to lift from my shoulders. Ethan drove with a steady hand, his expression peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since the day he received his medical degree. I looked at him and realized that the sickly boy who used to gasp for air in the middle of the night had become the strongest person I knew. He told me that he finally felt like the chapter of his life involving his biological mother was closed for good, and that he didn't feel the need to ever mention her name again. We reached the small house where we had spent so many years fighting for his survival, and it felt more like a sanctuary than it ever had before. Inside the house, I sat at the same kitchen table where I had once stared at piles of unpaid medical bills and empty pill bottles, wondering how we would make it through the week. The fear that had lived in my chest for 17 years was completely gone, and in its place was a quiet certainty that love is something you earn through action rather than blood. Ethan made me a cup of tea and sat across from me, telling me that he had already set up a foundation in my name to help other aunts and grandparents who were raising sick children alone. He said he wanted to make sure that no one else had to sell their jewelry or cry in the shower just to keep a child alive. I realized then that my life hadn't been thrown away as the relatives had once suggested, but instead it had been invested in the most valuable way possible. My sister had asked what had happened to the poor boy she left behind, but the truth was that he had become everything she never believed he could be. He was a scientist, a protector, and a son who knew the true value of loyalty and sacrifice. As the sun began to rise on a new day, I felt a sense of closure that didn't require an apology or a reconciliation, because the results of my choice were sitting right in front of me. Some stories don't need a dramatic revenge to be satisfying, because sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and watching the person who abandoned you realize what they lost. My sister had walked away from a burden and ended up with a hollow life, while I had embraced that burden and ended up with a soul full of purpose. I leaned back in my chair and watched Ethan look through some old photos of us from the hospital years, and I knew that if I had to go back to that rainy night 17 years ago, I would choose him all over again. The cost of love was high, but the return on that investment was a life that neither of us would ever trade for anything in the world.